Okay, so hopefully you found that entertaining. Now let's transition into obedience. So, conformity, there was no direct request. You're just trying to fit in with the group or use them for information. Compliance, there's an official request, but the person isn't necessarily an authority figure and they don't have any right to make you do it. In obedience, we have an authority figure who commands you to do something, and now what we're going to try and understand is the situations in which you respond to those commands affirmatively and do what you've been asked, as opposed to when you rebel. Okay, so we're going to start by talking about Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram was a standard social psychologist who was doing research on things like the concept of 6 degrees of separation can be traced back to a study that Stanley Milgram did. He was also very interested in deviance, like how the rest of people respond when you behave in an unusual way, things like that. But he was watching in the early 1960s the Nuremberg trials, where the Nazi criminals were being tried for their atrocities during the war. And criminal after criminal was invoking the "I was under orders" defense. They called it the Eichmann defense, actually, at the time. So he was trying to understand how Nazis could say, I did these awful things to other human beings because I was under orders. And he thought, there's no way that Americans would sit there and say, I did this bad, horrible thing because an authority figure told me to. We would rebel. That was his basic theory going into it. So he actually before he did his... delivered like the findings from his study, he asked a gathering of psychologists at the American Psychological Association meeting, what percentage of people do you think in my research were willing to harm an innocent person? And the psychologists estimated about 1%, that they'd have to be probably psychopathic or something to harm an innocent person. So knowing that professionals in the field thought that it would be very rare to find people who would harm an innocent person, you should be really intrigued by Milgram's findings. So let's start off by explaining exactly how the study was designed. So first off, Milgram was a researcher at Yale University, which is in New Haven. So he put an ad in the local newspaper to recruit participants. He thought, if I recruit students, we might get a false impression of obedience because students might go along with things more than an average everyday person would do. So he recruited from the New Haven population and using a want ad in the newspaper. And all he offered them was car fare, so you could, ride the bus or a taxi or whatever, get to campus and participate in this research. So he had his initial study was all men, and they were from all different walks of life and things. So he had lots of different kinds of people. They arrive to the lab, and they're told to wait in this waiting room, and it's 2 men sitting there, and they both act as if they're real participants who have been recruited through the newspaper ad. But it turns out that one is a real participant and one is a confederate of the study. You'll notice that that's a really common theme in social psychology. We have a person who thinks everybody here is a participant, and then everybody else is actually a confederate, and they're reading from a script and doing their pre-planned behaviors. So the researcher comes out in a white lab coat, explains a little bit about how this study is going to be a study of the effects of punishment on learning, and he makes a big show of a fair drawing to determine who's going to be the teacher and who's going to be the learner. But it turns out that both slips of paper say teacher because the real participant draws first, needs to get a slip of paper that says teacher because the real participant is always going to be the teacher. And then the confederate, when he opens his piece of paper, he says, oh, mine says learner. All right, so we have this so-called random assignment, but the truth is the real participant's always the teacher and the confederate's always the learner. They go into the lab and you see this kind of blurry version of a picture of the buttons that the teacher is going to push to administer shocks. And over those buttons you see labels that categorize a string of 4 buttons as The lowest one was characterized as slight, then moderate, then strong, very strong, intense, extreme intensity, danger, severe. And then the final one says XXX. All right. Well, that makes you think you're probably not supposed to do it past probably like 195, the very strong, right? So everybody looks at that. The teacher and the learner both look at that. And the learner says something sort of like, I hope I do well because I don't want to get those higher shocks. Then they take the Confederate into actually all three of them, the researcher, the Confederate, and the teacher all go into the room where the Confederate is going to be seated. They put him into a chair and they strap his arms to the chair. So it's very clear to the teacher that there's no way for the Confederate to get out unless somebody lets him out. And of course, the researcher says we have to strap his arms to the chair because he can't be moving. It could interfere with the electrodes and stuff. And so as they're strapping him down, the learner kind of casually, a little nervously says, "Is this going to be dangerous? Because I have a heart condition. Is this going to harm me?" And the researcher says, "Oh no, it's the shocks may be painful, but they aren't harmful. You'll be fine." But the teacher heard that, right? So the teacher knows that the Confederate is being strapped down and can't get out, and that the learner has a heart condition. All right, and so this is how it's set up. The Confederate is over there in their own room with a door closed, supposedly giving answers while their arm is strapped to the chairs, and they're being strapped to an electrode. The teacher is in the room with the researcher, and the researcher is very close to the teacher, just a couple of steps away. So it's important to know everybody's proximity to each other. Now they can hear the learner through the wall. So it's not like an isolation chamber. So they can hear anything he says. Anytime he bumps the desk or something like that, they can hear him over there. All right. And so now the teacher is told this is a study of learning. And so the teacher first goes through a series of word pairs. And then he goes through it again, but this time only reads the first member of the pair and then gives some response options. And the learner is supposed to say which of those response options is the second member of the pair. Anytime the learner is wrong, he gets shocked, and it's a progressively stronger shock each time in 15-volt intervals. All right, so I'm setting it up for you the way it sounds to the teacher. Now I'll give you the little secret that only the researcher and the learner know, which is that there really are no shocks being administered. The learner is not getting shocked at all. He's just reading from the same script. He always says the same things. So all of it is just the teacher believing that he is shocking the learner. So I think that's all the things I need to tell you for the setup. So now everything goes, I did forget one little detail, which is when they are strapping the Confederate down, they put the electrode on the teacher and they give him like a 30-volt shock so that he'll really believe that there's electricity going in. So actually the only person in the whole study who gets shocked is the teacher, and he gets, I think it's a 30-volt that he gets for a little demonstration, so that he'll feel it and know that there's electricity and really believe that he's shocking that learner. Everything goes pretty decently well at the beginning, but at some point around the strong level, the Confederate starts to yell "ow" when he gets shocked. And then if the teacher says anything like, shouldn't we go check on him, or he said "ow" or whatever, the researcher has like a script that he goes through to try and encourage the teacher to continue. And so he'll say, first is "please continue." If the teacher expresses additional reluctance to do the shock, then the researcher will say, "the experiment demands that you continue." And then if the teacher still doesn't want to give the shock, the final coup de grace, this will make him do the shock for sure idea was that the researcher would say, "you have no choice, you must continue." So the researcher says, "please continue," and the teacher, it's really important to note, doesn't say, "oh good, thank goodness, because I really wanted to continue shocking this individual in the other room." The teacher instead says, "but okay," right? Like they're conflicted. They're not happy about administering the shock. So let's look at how the shocking went. So 100% of the teachers shocked at the slight level. And that's probably not that surprising since all of them received a slight shock. They probably didn't think it was that harmful. Almost all continued shocking up to 120 volts in that moderate range. There was a big drop off between moderate and strong, and that's probably because that's the point where the learner started yelling "ow," and so people dropped out. And then the learner did more and more kinds of verbal objections. Ow, let me out of here. My heart's starting to bother me now. He was saying those kinds of things from the script. But what's interesting is how you have that one big drop off between moderate and strong, and then you don't get another really big drop off for the rest of the shocking. At the intense level, you see a bit of a drop off, and that's when he stopped responding. The learner just stopped saying anything. So what else is the teacher to conclude except for that I just shocked that guy to death, right? Because he said he has a heart problem. He was saying ow, he was saying let me out. At one point he was just sitting in there saying let me out, let me out, let me out, let me out, let me out. He wasn't even responding anymore, just saying let me out. Then the last shock that I gave, he went ow, and then he went silent. So if you got past that hump, it's really likely that you would stick to shocking all the way to the very end. And there were people who continued shocking at the 450 level until finally the researcher called the experiment. 65% of the respondents shocked all the way to the end. That is not what the psychologists thought when they were at the APA meeting, is it? They thought 1% would shock all the way to the end. So what is going on? What is the disconnect between thinking only psychopaths and war criminals would harm an innocent person, and then the evidence that 2/3 of people would harm an innocent person? What is going on? Well, I forgot I was going to show you this video. So just in case you're thinking, well, I mean, that happened in 1961. People were a lot more, willing to follow authority. Here's a nice one from the BBC showing you that, modern people will do it. And this also shows you this is a really good replication, shows you exactly how it was run. So go ahead and watch this video. We'll come back and talk about why did people shock at this level after the video.